Good morning and welcome to the Mitigation Planning Coffee Break Series, and today's topic, incorporating climate adaptation into natural hazards mitigation planning. My name is Jonathan Johnson and I am your host today. Your lead presenter for today's training is Kate Skaggs. Also presenting with Kate this morning are Dan Rizza and Michael Caldwell. If you are ready to go, Kate, I'll pass it over to you.
Yep. Yes. Yeah, thank you all for joining this morning. We have a really great presentation for you all today. We have Michael Caldwell from the Quinault Indian Nation and Dan Rizza from Climate Central talking today. So we are here to talk about how to integrate climate adaptation into hazard mitigation planning. There are a number of objectives for today, but if you leave today's webinar with anything, we want you to realize that the hazard mitigation planning process is a tool that can be used for climate adaptation. That this is really sort of what we're going to be talking about today, and that there is funding available to help with this. Everything else during this presentation will highlight how that looks and examples of how to do that. We're going to move forward through a number of areas. And I just want to use this agenda as a way to keep in mind of sort of where we're going. So we'll start with the review of mitigation planning, climate adaptation, and then explore some areas within your hazard mitigation planning process where climate adaptation could be considered. Dan will go through a couple of tools available. We'll review some funding opportunities, and then we'll turn it over to Michael to show what that can look like. So to start with, mitigation, you have seen this icon before in other coffee break series. So the reduction or elimination of long-term risk to human life and property from hazards. This is sort of what mitigation, it starts with before a disaster and then after for intermediate and long-term recovery. Sorry, I'm very nervous, and we'll continue. So hazard mitigation and climate adaptation are very similar. They're using different languages to explain the same thing. Emergency managers will be more familiar with mitigation, and land use planners or people coming from the climate change background will be more familiar with climate adaptation. So this webinar is really going to help define the different languages. If you come from the climate background, you're going to recognize climate mitigation to be more to do with greenhouse gas reductions. So hazard mitigation is climate adaptation. Going back and forth. Okay. So resilience, we talk about this a lot. This definition comes from the Rockefeller Foundation, the capacity to prepare for disruptions, recover from shocks and stresses, and adapt and grow from a disruptive experience. This is a very broad term. This is going to mean something different to each community. Resilience is sort of this overall series, and what does that look like in your community? So we are going to be moving through this, not defining it for your community, that resilience does look different in every community, and that mitigation contributes to that as well as adaptation. So mitigation increases resilience. This is also another image that you've seen from other coffee break series. Resilience not just impacts action, but also planning, reduces impacts, prevents future vulnerability, and contributes to a resilient community. So as resilience is this overall theory, so is adaptation. This is another definition from the Rockefeller Foundation. shifting from an old paradigm of disaster relief and recovery to one of planning, preparation, and resilience. This is mitigation. This isn't an old paradigm. That adaptation and hazard mitigation, you are already doing this with hazard mitigation planning, but mitigation is planning, preparation, and resilience. So again, we're just trying to go back to if your community wants to look at climate adaptation, that hazard mitigation planning is a tool to do that. And this is just to reiterate, adaptation can mean something different from every community. So it is a process that intends to reduce long-term risks from hazards. This came from the Baltimore Hazard Mitigation Plan. The IPCC report talks about adaptation in the terms of moderating harm and adjusting to climate change and its effects in future conditions. So we really do recognize that resilience is a broad term, adaptation is a broad term, and that the hazard mitigation planning process is a tool to move that discussion forward, to bring partners together to say what is important to you and what does this actually look like in your community. For the adaptation planning cycle, the community can do a separate adaptation plan, and this is one example from the California Planning for Adaptive Communities that tries to lay out 9 steps in the adaptation planning cycle. This is different than the hazard mitigation planning process. So the hazard mitigation planning has steps set up for it, has requirements that are necessary. This adaptation planning cycle is if a community wanted to do a separate adaptation plan, here are steps you could move forward. I'm presenting this to show the overlap between the hazard mitigation planning process and this potential planning cycle, where the gray steps on top are part of the vulnerability assessment that can be in the first part of the hazard plan, whether the hazard assessment or the stakeholder engagement, and that the blue steps are adaptation strategies that could be that could translate into the mitigation strategies. This is another way of showing that adaptation planning and hazard mitigation planning can overlap in a number of really critical areas. And just we'll finish this review portion by just highlighting that that the hazard mitigation plan, again, is a tool for this, that climate adaptation planning can be completely separate, but they have many similar goals of long-term risk reduction. That if you're looking at natural hazards and what is at risk in your community, recognizing that we are noticing changes and how the impacts of climate change will exacerbate those existing hazards. So when you're moving through the hazard mitigation planning process, where could that be integrated? And this is another way of looking at it. This is from the Oregon State Hazard Mitigation Plan. On the left are Adaptation Framework climate risks, and in green are the Oregon natural hazard mitigation hazards. And it's just another crosswalk for looking at what are climate risks and how will those impact existing hazards that were already considered in the plan. Also recognizing that the changes in habitat, of course there'll be changes in habitat, but that this is really just to highlight the overlap in existing hazards versus what we're considering climate impacts. And you say hazard mitigation and I say adaptation. The goals are the same, to protect people, property, economy, natural resources, your way of life. This is a lot of information. These slides are full of resources, links. It's not all meant to be digested during this webinar, but to be looked at afterwards. Within the state hazard mitigation plans, there are requirements for considering future conditions. and that looking at future conditions as potential climate impacts, increasing risk and vulnerability, and how to look at that within the hazard mitigation plan. And this, these goals are how to maintain your community's way of life. How can your identity be reflected in adaptation strategies? Is it looking at historic preservation? Is it preservation of natural resources? Is it maintaining self-sufficiency? All of these concepts that you're already using in your hazard mitigation planning process can also be considered adaptation.
Hey, Kate.
Yeah.
This is John. Sorry. Forgot to remind you for the second poll.
Oh, got it.
25. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. Okay. All right. Yeah, so I've been doing a lot of talking. We'll just open this one poll just to gauge, do you look at climate adaptation in your current plan?
Sorry for the interruption, Kate.
No, thank you.
And then as soon as the poll's done.
This is my first webinar.
Yeah. As soon as the poll's done, just remember to close it on your end. So. Continue.
Yep. So yeah, it looks like pretty even between this doesn't apply to me and yes, there has been climate integration into the plan. Okay. All right, so this is just another way of looking at overlap, and that's great to see that hazard mitigation plans are starting to look at this more. And this is just taken from the the state mitigation plan review guide and the local mitigation plan review, just screenshots of where they are within the guide if you want to look at this more. Okay, so all right, for this one, we're going to open a poll before I dive into stakeholder engagement. Has adapting to climate impacts or future conditions come up in discussions in your planning process, regardless if it's made it into the actual plan? All right, it also seems to be a mix between yes, absolutely, and no, this doesn't apply to me. So when we're starting to move into, how does this actually look? It's pretty theoretical at this point, what I've been talking about. It seems clear from the poll responses that you already are aware of climate adaptation and how to integrate it into your plan. So this is just from Region 10, some examples of how that could look in this area. So for stakeholder engagement, these are just a couple examples from King County and then Eugene Springfield multi-jurisdictional plan. That, again, this is the hazard mitigation planning process is a tool to move this process, move this discussion forward. So if you don't want to do a separate climate adaptation plan, if it feels like the hazard mitigation plan is coming up for review, and there's also interest in the community to look at climate adaptation so that these processes kind of align, how could you look at that? So stakeholder engagement is a key process. If in the steering committee meetings, in the beginning discussions of your plan, where could climate adaptation fit into? So King County brought a number of cities together to talk about these issues and to talk about how to address it within outreach, coordination, funding, and resources. And within the Eugene Springfield plan, within the vulnerability assessment, the areas that were highlighted as really vulnerable, they engaged experts in the field in those areas. So again, it's sort of really, I really want to highlight that the hazard mitigation plan is a tool to move these discussions forward, to be an excuse to work across departments, to find out what information is Public Works collecting that the Land Use Planning Department could use in a climate or in a comprehensive plan, and how could all of this information be set up to develop effective mitigation strategies for climate adaptation. So we're going to start moving into that hazard assessment. So there's the overall discussions that happen in the beginning of a plan, and then how does the assessment actually look like? How can you use climate data to reevaluate risks and vulnerabilities within the community and prepare for future risks? So this is a slide from a mitigation training. So this is the hazard assessment process. Within this process, within each step, there are areas to either integrate climate data or strategies that will lead to better mitigation actions. So this is an example from the Eugene Springfield one. Again, this information is tiny and there's a lot of text. It's meant as an example that you can reference after. That their process diagram had within the sector assessment, within the scores, within the analysis, at each point there were considerations for future conditions. And that based on that assessment, there are high-level findings that were used to inform the hazard mitigation plan. And so within these different assessments, you can look at different levels of risk. So for example, within flooding losses, not just paying attention to the 100-year floodplain, but what about the 500-year? If climate change is not a politically feasible term, then what about looking at different levels of flood risk and looking at which structures are at risk there? And then this tool is for Aberdeen. It was 3D modeling done. It's a viewer that you can go to with this link. It was 3D, or 3 foot top of the 100-year floodplain with tsunami risk, and then identifying structures that would be at risk to that. And just moving forward to different hazards, another example is wildfire. One can be more narrative. It doesn't have to be as technical as the flood. It really is just to see where can you integrate considerations for future conditions. And then we've seen a lot of public health in hazard mitigation plans, and this is another way of engaging the public, elected officials. What is important to your community? Maybe public health is the best way to move forward on these. And then a very critical component is requirement for the hazard mitigation plan is looking at changing probabilities. What is the future probability that this event is going to happen coming up? So an example of this is in the Idaho State Hazard Mitigation Plan, looking at vulnerabilities of increasing occurrences, changing precipitation patterns, increasing exposure and temperature. This is an example of how that can look that is more narrative instead of more technical. And then we're going to get into tools. How do you do this assessment? Where do you find data? Where is it available? Is it expensive? There are a lot of free resources out there and low-cost resources in each region, in each state. for multiple hazards. The U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit is a great place to start for multiple hazards. The NOAA Digital Coast website is great for coastal. And then each state has a state climatologist that will have information, as well as some regional climate groups, such as the Climate Impacts Group or a climate group out of Oregon State University. So these websites have an incredible amount of resources for multiple hazards. To show you one example of this, we're going to go into flooding and sea level rise, just for one part of this. So Jonathan, could you hand the presentation over to Dan?
Thanks, Kate. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for the good overview of adaptation, mitigation, and resilience. I'm Dan Rizza. I manage the program on sea level rise at Climate Central. We're a nonprofit research and news organization based in Princeton, New Jersey. And thanks for inviting me to share a little bit about the work we've done with NOAA and TNC to develop the sea level rise and coastal flood risk and coastal flood web tools comparison matrix. So we provide this free web tool on our site, and we created it to provide the planning and coastal management communities with an expandable chart to compare the functions and methods of publicly available sea level rise and coastal flood web tools. Only a few years back, there were only a small handful of web-based tools available, and now we're seeing a growth in that. So we came together with TNC and NOAA to provide this one-stop source for this kind of information for very specific comparisons on web tools specific to sea level rise. So just as there's no single tool to build a house, no one web tool will illustrate the coastal hazard problem and give you the adaptation answer. So some tools here focus on comprehensive information on coastal hazards, while others primarily identify choices in adapting to these hazards. And the scale and the resolution of the information provided within a specific tool or geographies where the tool is available, its intended use and broad classification, for example, tools that assess risk and vulnerability versus identifying adaptation options. We considered all of these as we designed and implemented the matrix. And I'll move now to show you how it works. It's available on our website here at sealevel.climatecentral.org/matrix. And essentially what we've done is we reached out to the web tool developers across the country, and if they had web tools available for their state, they provided us with that information for their columns in the matrix. So I'm going to click, first you click your geographic location, so let's click national for now. I think I have it loaded up. And so you can see for each web tool you have a certain column, and we cover 6 topic areas. And so as you see me demoing this and you think of a tool that you think should be in here, feel free to reach out to us and we can communicate with the web tool developer. The requirements to be included here is the tool has to be public, it has to be related to sea level rise or coastal flooding, it has to be science-based. And so you can choose, here are some of the categories. So you can, we have a general category, so we give you the general geographic scope for the different tools. So here's Climate Central's, we have a surging seas risk finder. And here in NOAA's sea level rise and coastal flood viewer, TNC's coastal resilience tool, and NOAA's coastal flood exposure mapper. And as you scroll down, you can find out a description of the tool, its target audience, its main outputs, its top 3 strengths and top 3 limitations to give you a sense of the context here, and a point of contact. So if you have questions about the tool, you can reach out to any of the people listed here. In the sea level rise and flood scenarios section, we give you very specific information such as what is the base sea level elevation, or what are the flood layers represented, or how are they represented. And so I won't go into too much detail now, but we also provide information about exposure analysis, shoreline processes. So does it cover coastal erosion or does it not, for example? Technical specifications. And so as you choose different geographic areas, so for example, here we're looking at Virginia. So you can, you'll see the same national tools here, but then you'll see some specific Virginia tools. Folks from VIMS imported their tools into here. Here's a page for Massachusetts. So we've got the MORIS, the Massachusetts Ocean Research Information System, Cape Cod Commission, etc. So we do have it for the West Coast as well. So if we look at, let's see, California, for example, here are the California tools available. We do plan to update the matrix to improve the user interface and allow users to download fact sheets for each web tool. And as you click on the tools at the top, we send you directly to those tools. So for example, if you clicked on Surging Seas, you can come to, this is our web tool, which provides kind of a wide range of coastal flood risk analyses related to sea level rise and flooding. We also provide maps. And then if you clicked on NOAA's tool, you could see the sea level rise viewer. So another web tool that has powerful processes within it and functions. We also have, here's TNC's Coastal Flood Exposure Mapper. And a lot of these tools are complementary, so they have functions that the others don't. And here's the TNC tool for California. And then you have other tools like Massachusetts, et cetera. So the other thing I wanted to mention, besides the matrix, is the fact that a lot of these similar groups we're working to develop free tools and resources and guides applicable to FEMA's community rating system. So the National Flood Insurance Program's CRS is a voluntary rating program that recognizes communities for implementing floodplain management practices. I don't need to explain this to folks on the webinar, but I just wanted to walk you through this slide quickly, and I provided the links so you can access them later. But we've developed a guide on how you could use the Surging Seas tool within the community rating systems to support activities, and so that's available on our site. We're updating it for the new guide, and here's the green guide from ASFPM, which provides users with really useful context and case studies on how to move forward with CRS. I list that in the slide. TNC has their own community rating system explorer, and it's another powerful resource available on the web. And you can also access, and NOAA will be releasing, let me go back to the slide quickly, but NOAA will have a new interactive online how to map our space for community rating system credit and companion GIS workflow system on their site, and it will detail the process for mapping and calculating credits for preserved open space for 7 easy to follow steps. So that will be available soon as well. So I think that's the gist of what I wanted to cover, Kate. So I might pass it back over to you.
All right.
But if anyone has questions about what we covered, feel free to reach out, and I can direct you to the right folks.
All right, thank you so much, Dan. So again, we just wanted to highlight tools that are available, that are out there. There is way too much to cover in a 1-hour webinar, so this is just for one specific hazard to look at flooding, and just to give you a sense of what is available. So this link will be available in the presentation after, as well as these are the resources that Dan showed as the last slide, all available after as well. And we wanted to mention the community rating system because of the emphasis in the new manual on future conditions, preservation of open space, maintaining natural floodplain functions. All of these sound like hazard mitigation, and they are also climate adaptation as well. Again, these are an incredible amount of tools. They're meant to be for your viewing pleasure after the webinar. And I'll just quickly move forward. Other ways of exploring climate adaptation in mitigation plan is the requirement for plan integration. How could a community integrate hazard mitigation into other planning mechanisms? The Growth Management Act, comprehensive plans, capital improvement plans. So again, this is just another way of looking at climate adaptation in the hazard mitigation planning process. So for example, in Thurston County, one of their mitigation strategies is to develop a climate adaptation plan separately. And so one thing I wanted to mention is that the plan integration is a way of, this really is, how can we talk with other departments? How can we help integrate this information into not just a planning tool, but regulatory mechanisms, day-to-day decision-making, long-term strategic planning? What changes are we noticing now? And if we are investing a monetary amount that crosses a threshold, or if we're investing in an infrastructure that has a life expectancy of 30 to 50 years, what do the future conditions look within that time period? So really making sure that this investment is good for business, is good for the protection of life and property, good for your legacy, maintaining your community's way of life and recovering faster after an event. This is the goal when we say plan integration. And these words all sound familiar for hazard mitigation, and it's just the reiteration that this is also climate adaptation, that it doesn't have to be this completely separate plan if that doesn't make sense in the community. So then using all of this information, how can we help update the mitigation strategies? This slide and the next couple slides you saw last month in the Coffee Break series for developing mitigation strategies. So this is the process that a community would go through in their hazard mitigation plan, and within all of these can be considerations for future conditions. So that this one as well, the jurisdiction will go through this process. They're going to identify actions based on their hazards. So what would that look like if you took future conditions into account? And what are the set of strategies? What means the most to your community? You'll have priority strategies, but then what is most important? Is there a lot of development happening in areas that are very vulnerable? If you're a coastal community, is this happening downtown on the waterfront? It's not saying don't build in these areas, but it's saying if you're investing time and money and resources in these vulnerable areas, how can we take care of that more? And so is there, should there be thresholds for a separate review that happens, in the capital budget process or in day-to-day decision-making that happens? And then, how can you identify lead agencies or departments to help facilitate that conversation outside of the hazard mitigation planning process? And that this hazard mitigation plan is a tool to help move those discussions forward and continue those along after the planning process is over. And this, again, this is the last slide from last Coffee Break series. There are these action categories. Within each of these actions are also adaptation strategies. So, for example, freeboard, preservation of natural floodplain functions, looking at living shorelines or other areas where not only can help protect habitat, but can also reduce wave energy. Education and awareness programs, we've seen really great outreach campaigns for different hazards, but what does that look like moving into the future? And then structure and infrastructure projects, that's where it gets in. Are these, do you design differently if future conditions are projected in a certain direction? This is an example from the city of Reedsport in Oregon, just looking at how they updated their mitigation actions based on findings within a climate change assessment. And this is again from the Eugene Springfield plan. Their mitigation action directly relates to the problem statement from their climate vulnerability assessment. And this is just another example of actions that directly relate to what was found. And this is just, again, the Adaptation Framework example. And then what we mentioned at the very beginning, that there is funding available to help with these planning efforts. Community flood mitigation projects can be funded under FEMA Hazard Mitigation Assistance. These are projects that are labeled as hazard mitigation, but they also address future impacts and can help prepare your community for what may come. And just public service announcement that I'm sure you all know that the flood mitigation assistance and pre-disaster mitigation grants are open now. They close November 14th. These projects can also be funded under Hazard Mitigation Grant Program following a presidentially declared disaster. There's more information can be found on the HMA website, and the State Hazard Mitigation Officer contact information for your state in Region 10 is provided at the end of this presentation. So for more information, you can reach out to that person. So this has been very theoretical. We've talked a lot, given your examples, but I want to hand it over now to Michael Hardwell from the Quinault Indian Nation to talk about what this can actually look like on the ground and in a community.
Why, thank you. I better put my glasses on so I can actually look like my slide. And this is my contact information. I'm a proud graduate of Eastern Washington University with a couple of master's degrees, and I'm a American Institute of Certified Planner. So again, next slide, please. I wanted to show you where in Region 10, where the Quinault Indian Nation is. And if you go to Portland and travel down the border to the Columbia River and then go up a couple of bays, you have Grays Harbor County. And then when you continue up the shoreline, you have a bump out, and that's Point Grenville. And you continue up, you have Cape Elizabeth, which is right behind me if you guys are actually getting my video feed, and it aligns up with the Quinault Canyon, which is one of the steep canyons along the ocean shore, the ocean floor. Then if you head out along the ocean floor, 4 giant steps, you see where the world breaks apart. Why are we concerned about the world breaking apart, or this global perspective for this? Being a Boy Scout, our plan is to be prepared. So generally what happens, and you can see at the bottom of the slide, where the world breaks apart down in California, when the tectonic plates shift, water moves, and water moves along the ocean floor, up the canyons, right into the shoreline. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And I was going to show you, my office is one of the closest buildings to the aquatic habitat. We have this taken from, this photo is our lower village along the Wild and Scenic Quinault River, which is not dammed. So therefore it is, can rise and it is not contained with flood controls, and we have a seawall on the beach. I mean, I've shown this picture that at low tide to show you that, yes, the water comes up twice a day, right, basically to our little area, and what would happen if the plates shift or we have earthquakes and that creates tsunamis. People asking, maybe asking, why should we prepare for tsunamis? It'll never happen in our lifetime. I've been working here at the Quinault Indian Nation for 20 some odd years. Most recently, for the last 5 years, there's been 8 tsunamis that have we've been warned about. So whenever Hawaii burps or Alaska burps, or one of the big ones was Japan basically had their major concerns. We get water. So again, within our hazard mitigation plan, we took a look at what happens when we get water. Well, we not only get water from the ocean, we get water from the sky. So again, we had to take a look at what happens when the weather warms up. Rain falls as rain, as not as snow in the mountains. The glaciers disappear, and instead of being retained in the hills, the Olympic Mountains, which is the source of our river, what happens when that water comes down gradient? Well, as you can see, it empties into the ocean. And so we've had to take a look at what happens, what's the probability of that happening in the very near future. So again, next slide, please. This is what happens if a tsunami occurs when the plates break apart. So on the slide, you can see community center. I'm actually west of the community center. And if the NOAA buoys several miles out, you detect a change in the wave patterns, meaning that there's been an underground earthquake, we will have approximately 15 minutes to escape the purple area and get to the safe area up gradient. It takes me approximately 22 minutes to walk that site. So again, I have a life jacket in my office because my staff said, Mr. Cardwell, in the aftermath of a tsunami, we want to be able to find you and bury you properly. So I thank my staff, but I want to plan so that we save our communities as well as plan accordingly. So again, like I said, being a good planner, we are looking to build up out of the tsunami impact area in an area that says relocation area up by admin. And that is our goal, is to move out of an ecologically fragile area that's impacted by river water as well as ocean water, and move up into an area that is safe for everybody. I mean, we are blessed with elders and youth, so again, we see this planning as critical. And I want to say it's also eventual. I believe in our creation stories that the first Native Americans, quote, came ashore in the Quinault Canyon as they followed the food sources when the world was flat. Basically before the last ice age. And we've been here ever since, and we will continue to be here. Next slide, please. What we've taken a look at is, what we're looking at is something like I believe every plan should have, and it's, this is the equivalent of going to a farmer's almanac and saying, hi, I'm going to travel across the country in pick a month, any month, and visit relatives. What should I pack? In Arizona in May, I may have to pick a light jacket if I am above X amount of feet. In Iowa in June, I better have shorts and a lot of sunblock. In Florida in August, I better have a hat because the sun will be coming down on me, as well as flip-flops and a swim shirt. So again, we've used the tools mentioned prior to take a look at our region and what will the weather be like in the near future. I mean, I mentioned the Farmer's Almanac. Certainly, you would take a look at the weather report on the nightly news to do the trend analysis of where I'm going to be traveling in the next week. I just came back from family vacation, and I knew that it was going to be sunny and warm in the areas I was going to be at. So again, I dressed and packed accordingly. Towns can't dress and pack accordingly, so therefore you have to be able to take a look within your hazard mitigation plan as to what will the future conditions be should this or this or this happen. On the Quinault Indian Reservation, we've been impacted by tsunamis, we've been impacted by Mount St. Helens, certainly as a volcano, certainly Mount Rainier is much closer, and you're saying to yourself, well, we don't have an ocean or a volcano in our area. You're right, but you're going to have to figure what the rain patterns are, what the water availability is. Certainly, where is the highest region for earthquakes? Well, it's not the area with the volcanoes, even though we have basically earthquakes every day. Most of them you can't even feel. It's areas where in the Midwest where man-made is potentially shifting the hydrological features underground and as such. So again, the tools mentioned can help you take a look at the weather, and through your mitigation plans, you can take a look at what happens if this event occurs, that event occurs, etc. This slide is very, very good because, again, I wanted to show to the readers of our plan that in the future, it's going to get warmer. It's going to get drier, and it's going to impact our forests as well as our fisheries. So again, if we're dependent upon both of those for our economic development, we have to plan accordingly. As I mentioned previously, the storms would roll off the Pacific, blow up the valley, hit the mountains, fall as snow, and be captured by the glaciers. Our last glacier, Anderson Glacier, the mouth, the source of water for the Quinault River, has finally disappeared. So again, taking a look at global warming, weather change, and how can we adapt to that? So again, we're taking a look at putting in engineered log jams in order to make sure that the surging water doesn't come down and wipe out historic farms and as well as our historic village, which was probably placed in the wrong spot, but you know, we are the remnants of some failed federal planning on the Bureau of Indian Affairs thing, and you know, we are adapting to where we live and what we are looking to do in the very near future. So again, I think that's kind of a nutshell of how we put everything together in our plan so that we can, it is user-friendly for all readers, and it's not a big scary book of when a tsunami that it comes that's more than a pen size that hits our shores. What are we going to do? We're going to put into place our planning that we practice. We're going to have the sirens go off. We're going to go to our evacuation spots, and we're going to basically radio out for help. And I think everybody is looking upon these plans as, what can we do for our community? Well, the best thing we can do is plan, practice, and be prepared. So you have basically your call list of who you're going to call. It's not going to be Ghostbusters, you know, and such. And here is a picture of our Quinault Wild and Scenic River, and this is where Manifest Destiny ended, and we are still around, and hopefully we'll be able to use good planning, and our example can help you in your community.
Thank you so much, Michael.
I'll sign off.
Thank you. I know we're at the top of the hour. Thank you so much, Michael, for talking about your community. This is really meant to highlight that a hazard mitigation plan can be identified with your community. What is important? How can it be a tool that does not just sit on the shelf, but can be easier to read, can interact, with different departments? That resilience is a moving target, but it's not a final destination. And there's always something more that you can do. So it's going to be, every year when you do your maintenance, or every 5 years, what can that look like? And in very high capacity communities, it's going to look very different than it does for smaller communities. So climate adaptation, in one community, it could be, taking one sentence about looking at what do the climate conditions look like for your community, and recognizing that might be it. Or can public works department start noticing which roads are flooding during nuisance flood events or king tides, So paying attention to one small thing, or is it, contracting with a university to do downscaled climate models? So it really can be a wide range of actions, and just moving that one step forward, and that it doesn't have to be a separate plan, that the hazard mitigation planning process is a tool that can be used to address the impacts of climate change. And for state plans, it's required to at least consider future conditions. So this is, again, where we came from. There's a list of resources, documents, trainings, all available after this webinar. The next September webinar is Tribal Mitigation Planning. And then just a couple of trainings that will be hosted by FEMA Region 10 are 2 G318 trainings in Anchorage and Alaska coming up in September and November. And then here are contacts for all of the presenters, and then within each state, your state hazard mitigation officer, if you're interested in learning more about the funding opportunities, the FMA and PDM grants that are open now. And that's it. So I know we're at the top of the hour. If you have any questions, yes, Brett.
Can you just go put that last poll up there for the feedback?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Brett.
Thank you all for going 3 minutes over, and I'm happy to stay on the line if there are any questions that come up. And feel free to reach out to us afterwards.
We did have a couple Q&As if you guys have questions there. Hopefully we responded. Dan, you responded to a question about that matrix that covers Alaska, and that they plan to release it for Alaska, but unsure of the particular date. Of course, you can send an email out to alert when it's available. Dan's contact information is in here. Emma, you're just talking about projections and the sources. This is in the Keweenaw Indian Nations plan, and they do have a whole section in the plan there on the climate projection results and the data sources there. Michael, is the, I don't know if you want to type in there, is the Keweenaw Indian Nation Hazard Mitigation Plan publicly available on your website for anyone who wants to review it and see that whole section you guys have in the back on the climate adaptation projections?
I believe it is.
Okay, so folks, if you just want to be able to take there's a lot of detail, more than what Mike was able to cover about the work there, but you can do a Google search on Keweenaw Indian Nation Tribal Mitigation Plan or Mitigation Plan. You could get an opportunity to see that. And those are what we have coming in. Actually, I should put one. There was one more under the private chat. Dan, this is for you. It's a question about the sea level rise tool. Does it crosswalk with the tsunami hazard? Oregon has chronic climate-related coastal hazards and catastrophic tsunami hazard. It would be nice to see the impacts of both at the same time, the concern being non-integration and mitigation strategies. So, Dan, do you know if that tool crosswalks tsunami hazard?
So some tools in the matrix could be used to assess, screening level tsunami risk assessment. I mean, our tool, for example, Surging Seas, you can move the water slider up to 30 meters, so it could be applicable. So yes, I think the answer is some tools could be used for that.
It sounds great. All right, back to Kate. I guess back to you. And